So today we're going to look at accommodating anxiety. We're going to share from God's Word, discuss anxiety types and symptoms, dig into parental accommodation, including some examples, some research, and some things to consider. And then lastly, we're going to share how anxiety can be helpful and ways to refocus when it gets difficult. I'm just going to share a couple Bible verses with you real quick. You just read those yourself. Things that can help us and students when they're struggling. It's a little bit longer one, so I'll leave that up there for a minute. I think I'll talk about it a little bit later, but when kids are struggling with anxiety, one of the best things to do is look to God's Word and look in the back and look at the word peace, and then go and read a bunch of verses about peace and things like that, or fear, and that can help them work through that stuff. All right, so refocusing the mind and calming the heart. This verse is real important, obviously, when you think about destroying arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. And when we think about the thoughts that are making us anxious, and then that gets overwhelming, what do we have to do? We have to take that thought captive, right? And know that when we're being attacked in that situation, what do we need to do? We need to say the name of Jesus, right? And stop that from happening. It's not that easy, but with practice, that can actually help quite a bit. When you're reading from His Word, your focus is going to change. About 10 years ago, God gave me an acronym of focus. While watching a sermon, it was talking about the HALT principle. When you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, what do you do in that situation? And what God told me was, well, you have to stop, not only halt, but then what do you do after that? What do you do after you halt? And that was fix on Christ until satisfied. And so by praying and reading His Word and anything like that, we can refocus our mind and come to a better place in that situation. So the last one is, the slide is actually moved later in the presentation, so I'm just going to share from it. It basically talks about iron sharpens iron. As counselors and school staff and parents, we're all here to support the students, their academic success. And so we want to work with you guys today to share some things about parental accommodation and how that works, so you guys understand that a little bit better.
So before we get into that, I first want to define the difference between anxious thoughts and anxiety disorder. So in order to do that, I'm going to give you a little example. So yesterday I was going to a doctor's appointment for a bit of a check-in. And I'm new to the area, I'm from Wisconsin, so I'm meeting the doctor, and I realize I'm in the office and I don't know her name or her last name. And so I go, "What's up, doc?" And I'm like, "Okay, Bugs Bunny, calm down." I leave the doctor's office and I go complete anxiety mode. Stress of, why did I say that? How come I didn't go prepared? How did I not know her name? This lasted less than 5 minutes. I talked to my husband, he said, "That happens to me too. I could sometimes just blank, and that's okay." And we could laugh about it, and the anxiety stopped. And I didn't think about it again. However, imagine that this happened to you non-stop. Those spiraling thoughts, those stressors, day in, day out. That is often what a disorder feels like. And it feels like you're trapped. It feels like you don't know what's going on in your mind, and you need help. And it's okay to ask for help. So anxiety here is defined as an emotion characterized by feelings of tension, worried thoughts, and physical changes like increased blood pressure. And that's the difference between the disorder and stressors that are human nature. There is also more than one type of anxiety, and that's something that we often find in school counseling, is that it's important to know how it's being diagnosed by a psychiatrist or by a doctor. And that is why we encourage you or as families to go and check in with your psychologist or doctor if you feel that it's important to figure out this diagnosis. We can help with the symptoms and we can help problem solve at school, but it's important to know that there's many different types. There's generalized anxiety, there's social anxiety, separation anxiety, and even specific phobias in others. In 2012, 11.6% of teens had anxiety. And look at this jump here. In 2022, that jumped to 20.5%. Now there's different symptoms as we're talking about, and we'll get more into those diagnoses later in the presentation, but I also want to focus on the symptoms. You see that it's quick to fear the worst, excessive worry. So if it's going on where it's 6 months or longer, then we might be talking about an anxiety disorder here. You feel frequent panic attacks, outbursts you're seeing, avoidant behavior in any social setting. That could be social anxiety, not wanting to go anywhere where there's a big crowd or where there's a lot of people, or you go into panic mode. Even physical ailments, you see your heart. A lot of your heart is pumping up and breathing in. That's why we encourage breathing techniques, because not enough oxygen is getting to the mind when we go into a spiral attack. You even might sense in your children a lot of stomach aches or complaints that they're showing up in their body. Not only that, but we also have more symptoms too. We have clinging to a trusted adult, not wanting to let go, or even a lack of participation or willingness to join in on peer-related opportunities. So these are all just different symptoms as you might be seeing, and as I'm talking, you might be even going to places in your memory of, oh, I see when anxiety started to come up in my child, or I know when there are moments of stress. It's important to define the two differences though, based on how long it's happening, the settings it's happening, and where it's happening, who's around. That's the slide Jason was talking about. I'll just leave it for a second. Now, as we get into parental accommodation, I'm going to be defining that for you guys as we're talking about that today. So you'll see that it's changes that parents and other family members make to their behaviors and lifestyle to their child's anxiety. Accommodating, we know it's rooted in a place of love. You love your children. We love our families here. We want to accommodate. It's almost a natural instinct, right, to accommodate. And it's the rule, not the exception. And I'm going to give it to Andrea to get more into what accommodating means.
So the best way to really understand what accommodation looks like is to talk through a couple of examples. So with separation anxiety, for instance, we have kids who don't want to leave a caregiver or a parent. And so when we accommodate to that, it can look like kids who want to crawl into bed at night with mom and dad. It can be a child who doesn't want you to leave them when you drop off for a birthday party, a sports practice. Maybe they're having a hard time walking into school in the morning, and so you accompany them in. It can also look like, when you look at a specific phobia, even just taking the stairs, right, instead of riding the escalator up in the mall. So these are changes that we as adults are making in the situation to alleviate the stress that our children are feeling. So I'm going to walk you through a personal example, because even as a mental health provider, these are situations and experiences that we have as well with our own children. And so this is my son, Micah, who graciously allowed me to share his experience with you today. A few years ago, I got a call from school, and the school psychologist was on the other line saying, Micah wants to talk to you. And so he gets on the phone, he's crying, he's panicking, and he can barely get his words out, and all I hear is, right? He's crying. And so my mom heart is feeling stressed, I'm feeling panicked, and I don't know what's wrong. He hands the phone back over to the school psychologist, who says, Micah's really upset, somebody got sick in class. Okay, that makes sense. That's not an experience that anybody really wants to, right? And so she says, you're welcome to come pick him up, or he's welcome to stay and finish out the rest of the day. We will work with him to get him calmed back down and back in class. Now, I will be honest with you that every fiber in my body wanted to go and get him, right? I felt so bad for him. But I also knew that if I set that precedent, right, if I went and got him, that likely was going to be the expectation going forward. Mom's going to come get me when I feel uncomfortable and this feels hard. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to leave him at school. I know that he's safe. and I know that there are adults in the building who can help de-escalate. And so that's what we did. I left him at school that day. And of course, the rest of the day, right, I'm just like, that's all I'm thinking about, because my anxiety is like up here now. And of course, this isn't where the story ends. The next day, as my husband's bringing our kids to school, I get a call from him. I'm pulled over on the side of the road, Micah doesn't feel well. I'm like, oh great, he caught the bug that was going around in the classroom. And then I stopped for a second and I said, is he really sick? And he's like, well, I don't know. He's not getting sick. And I said, well, does he have a fever? No, he doesn't feel warm. I said, well, does he look sick? Right? Because as parents, like, you can just kind of look at your kids and you kind of know when something is off. And he said, no, he doesn't really look sick. And I said, well, I think you need to send him to school. I said, I think it's anxiety. And my husband's like, are you sure? And I was like, well, I'm not 100% sure. I'm not there. I can't see him. But I said, this sounds like anxiety. He doesn't feel well, right? He's worried about going back to school. And this is something that I think Katie touched on, but a lot of times our youngest kids are going to present with symptoms of not feeling well. They don't have the vocabulary to tell you that they feel anxious. They may not even know what anxiety is, and so they're going to tell you that they don't feel well. And I think our school nurse would say the same thing. Sometimes she ends up with frequent flyers down in her office who are just saying, I don't feel well. But really it's because there's a presentation or something going on in the classroom. Okay, so my son then continues to talk about people being sick in class. And he's coming home from school and that's all he wants to focus on. And so an accommodated response is going to continue to provide constant reassurance. So as a parent, you're maybe even going to your child and you're saying, are you okay? How are you feeling about this? And you're continuing to engage in that conversation. And we're not saying to not talk about it, but to find that balance, right? And so there came a time where I had to say to Micah, you know what, buddy? We've talked a lot about this, and now we're gonna move on to something else. If you still have those thoughts, I want you to send those up to God, right? He's gonna hear your heart and he's gonna hear your worries. So now we're a couple days into this situation and he comes home and he says, I just want to wear a mask to school because I'm just really worried about being sick. And this is like day 3 and 4 and he's going out the door with tears in his eyes and my heart is just feeling crushed. I'm feeling stressed. And so I'm like, fine, take a mask if it's going to make you feel better. We're kind of at the tail end of COVID and so it's still like, kind of normal. And so he goes to school with the mask in his backpack and he comes home and I said, Bud, did you end up wearing that mask today? And he said, no, I kept it in my backpack. And that's when I took a step back and I said, you know what, buddy, we're not going to pack a mask tomorrow, but I know that you're worried about being sick, but here's what you can do to keep yourself healthy, right? You can wash your hands, you can eat healthy, you can get lots of sleep. And so it was really kind of providing some logic to the ways in which we can keep ourselves healthy. And then of course he starts asking me about making accommodations in the classroom. So he doesn't want to sit by the student who got sick. He's scanning the room and trying to determine he would come home and say, Mom, so-and-so looked really pale in class. I think they might be getting sick. And so he was wanting me to reach out to the teacher, to see if maybe he could just work independently. And so an accommodated response is going to be the parent stepping in, right, to say or to ask for those accommodations in class. Now, I did reach out to the teacher to say, hey, this does continue to be a problem, and I want you to know that we're working through it, so please reach out to me if you have questions or concerns, but I wasn't making the request, if that makes sense. Okay, so you might be starting to wonder, what's the big deal with accommodating to your child's anxiety? What would be the harm if I had just gone and picked him up from class, or if I had continued to let him pack a mask? And this really illustrates this perfectly for us. So you have a child who's anxious, right? an adult steps in and provides some sort of accommodation, which in the short term provides an immediate sense of relief. Our child stops crying, they stop talking about it, they go to school, they do their presentation, whatever the case may be, there is a reduction in the amount of stress that they're feeling. However, because we've eliminated the opportunity for them to, because we've eliminated the opportunity for them to work through that hard situation, they now haven't developed the coping skills, right, and the resiliency to work through that next situation that's going to come up. And instead, they're looking to us as the adults, as the parents, to solve that problem for them. And so it really just becomes like a vicious cycle that becomes really difficult to break. So the funny thing is, most of us accommodate. I think the research says like 97% of moms tend to accommodate. And dads are right up there too. They're just not studied as frequently as moms are. But we all do it, right? And the reason that we do is because we want to protect our kids. We want to try to reduce their stress. But there's also some underlying beliefs that can happen too, such as anxiety is a bad thing, or it's something that we want to try to avoid. And the reality is that stress is actually beneficial in some cases, and I think Jason is maybe going to talk about that in a little bit. But this belief that anxiety should be avoided actually is not true. And if you are on social media, you might see like news articles or in groups that might say like trigger warning, right? As a way to try to get you to like stop because there's a sensitive topic that's coming up. But new data has actually been released on that says that it actually has the opposite effect. That it's not effective and that it actually increases readers' anxiety once they finally do start reading that article. And then there's reasons, really, that just get at basic needs, right? So we all need to be able to function in the short term. And so when you have a child who doesn't want to go to bed, and it's a school night, and it's getting to be 10:30, you've tucked them in 4 or 5 times, you're exhausted, and you need sleep. And so sometimes the reality is it's just easier. It's easier for us as parents to just allow that accommodation to happen. Okay, so I think Katie's going to talk a little bit about what the research says about accommodation.
So why do we accommodate? So accommodation is neither beneficial nor necessary for the recovery, is what researchers have found, because of how it prolongs it. If a student is learning these behaviors, and the way to resolve their behavior is to look into somebody else besides themselves, it really actually gives a disadvantage, as studies have shown, for them to problem solve on their own. And it is important to know that family accommodation predicts a pro-treatment response regardless of any kind of clinical treatment a child receives. We know that we want to do it out of their best interest, and because it can put a resolve on the issue right away. However, when you're looking at when this child becomes an adult and is then calling up, "Mom, how do I do laundry?" I'm so used to it, and being treated in a way where they look to others. As we get to put this effort of learning, how can I now learn these skills alongside those around me, looking to support me as I'm navigating accommodating anxiety, and how I can accommodate in a way that actually does a teamwork effort together with your student, knowing that they're not alone. They have it in them. God has created them, and He has your child in the best interest of not only your heart, but His heart, and His plans for their life is not to be stuck in a place of fear, not to be stuck in a place where they have to look elsewhere, but looking to Him for hope and for healing. Research also goes into show that why do we accommodate? So I don't have this on my slide, so I'll read it over here. So as we look to many anxious children tend to have at least one anxious parent, but we also identify with how this motivates us to want to resolve from based on our own projection of what we might be going through. So we all are working, we all have a lot of things going on in our own life, and sometimes our children look to us in that moment of, what is my parent doing? How is my parent feeling? And then feed off of that. And I think that is why research is also jumping to that as they've shown how students are very, very high intellectual, high processing, but also really want to know, how do I get out of this mindset? How do I get unstuck? How do I get unhooked? And as we look into navigate, we can give them the tools and the skills to get out of this frame of stress into a place of hope again.
Before we move on, I just got a request to share names. My name is Jason Palsy, middle school counselor. Katie Wellhouse, who just spoke, is the elementary school counselor, and Andrea Shoup is the high school counselor. All right, so before I share these next slides, I wanted to talk about, so consider the following stuff. Before we talk about that, I just want to mention that this is tough stuff. It's really obviously the research that they're doing on this, and as Andrea said, they get stuck in that cycle and then it can get worse and worse and harder to get out of that. So a lot of this really needs to be worked on with an actual therapist, whether it's a child's therapist or even a family therapist to work on, because it is something that you're doing kind of together as a family. So I just wanted to share that. So if you feel like we need more help with this, how do we do that? Therapist would be a good person to talk to about this stuff to help the family through this, making these changes. But if you look, I'm not going to read through all of them. But if you look at that, says don't pull all supports or accommodations immediately. Start small. Communicate a plan with your child. Begin to reflect on your role in the situation. Like, why am I accommodating? How is that helping? Could I be able to pull that accommodation and see how that would go? It's something that obviously as parents, you guys have to decide what works best for you. Stress test, obviously thinking about if you pull an accommodation, what's going to happen, all the things ways that it could fail. If it's out in public where that's happening, then how do we deal with that if something goes wrong? Have kind of a plan set up so that it's least stressful for everybody. Clear, constant communication, obviously. Partnership between spouses, obviously being on the same page in every way is obviously very important. Don't focus on aggressive behavior that follows. So I suppose if you start changing accommodations and you take some things away, what's going to happen? It's not going to necessarily be the greatest, but it could get a little bit worse before it starts to get better, because they're not going to be happy that you're taking that away from them. Yeah, that kind of explains that right there. Change in child behavior is the long-term goal, of course, not the immediate objective. So the behavior might not get better right away, and obviously it's hard to see that, right? Because as Andrea talked about, you want to take care of your kid and you want to make them feel better. And don't want to let them go through that difficulty, but sometimes that's the best thing to do. So. Positives, Andrea mentioned this too a little bit. It can be helpful and healthy. It's a signal that says something's coming that's going to be difficult, and it keeps you alert and ready to assess that problem. So it can be, you can talk to your kids about that. Oh, that's okay when that happens, because that's just your body telling you something that is hard that's coming up. But now how do we deal with that? What do we do with that information? So instead of allowing it to get out of hand, what we can do is we can talk about looking up Bible verses like I mentioned earlier, having them find a favorite Bible verse that they can just repeat over and over again. Taking the thoughts captive, the one we talked about earlier, is probably a really good one. When you think about taking thoughts captive and you think about deep breathing is one thing I'm going to talk about right now too, but deep breathing can really control and slow your heart rate. So you can actually force your heart to slow down, and then that anxiety can go down. Well, when you're reading God's word, that's actually like deep breathing for your mind, right? So when you're reading his word, you can actually I've actually done it many times when I've had a hard decision to make. God will wake me up in the middle of the night, and I'll go down to my office and I'll pull out my Bible and just start reading. And then my anxiety will go down, answers come out. It's all really, really neat thing that kids can learn how to do when they're pretty young. And that's something that would help them for the rest of their lives. So we talked about Bible verses, even memorizing ones, listening to certain music, not something crazy, but worship music or something calming can help. Visualization and deep breathing exercises. So we talked about deep breathing, slowing the heart. What's cool about that is you can also visualize. So I've had kids in my office do that. Where's your favorite place? Is it the beach? Is it your bedroom, sitting on your bed? Where is that? Where's your favorite place? So then they can close their eyes and pretend they're there. What do you smell? What do you see? All that stuff. So they can put themselves in their comfortable place. And then once they've done that, then they can do the deep breathing. And then that can help them to calm down and get back to class and be able to focus. The last thing I wanted to share was the 5 love languages. It's not on there, I don't think. Nope. So the 5 love languages, a cool thing about that is when kids are worrying about what's going on in life, it's because they're focused on negative things. And the 5 love languages talk about how to fill your love tank. And as kids, there's actually a child quiz, there's a teen quiz, and an adult quiz. So I have actually a copy of the teen quiz with me right here. If anybody wants to see it afterwards, I have tons of copies of them in my office because I'll go through them with middle schoolers, and then we'll actually talk about, like, well, now that you know this is your love language, what are your family love? And they'll say, well, my mom's this, my dad's this. They kind of already know once we've kind of explained the 5 love languages, which is really neat. But then when kids know what they need, they can ask for that. And that can help them not focus on anxiety and worry and focus on more positive things when they're feeling more loved and full in their love tank. So that's all we have for you.